Welcome to the Forge of Sagas, and today we're going to be building a Demonic Smelter out of this saber-toothed tiger skull that I got from the Hobby Lobby clearance rack, and this aquarium piece that I got from the pet store clearance rack. The first thing I wanted to do was to build up the height of this. I wanted this to be a piece of line of sight blocking terrain, so I grabbed this paint can to help me visualize what this piece would look like. I went through a couple of different layouts. Maybe I wanted this big opening on the other side, turn that around a little bit, maybe I want it long, but, in the end of the day, I went back to my original configuration. It just looked the best for me. So I grabbed my tape measure and figured out that this was going to be a 13-inch by 13-inch perfect square. I cut out a piece of half-inch thick pink insulation foam and traced the skull onto it. I let the jaw overhang a little bit because I knew that was going to be protruding from the rock face at the end of the day anyway. I did have to go back and trace the back of it though, so I just stuck my pencil in, let it fall, and then traced the line from that point, making a nice little arc. Once that was drawn in, I grabbed my knife, and I cut out the hole. As I cut out the next layer, I realized I might want a little bit of wiggle room down the mountain because I knew I was going to have to carve this into a slope, and this was going to probably be the top piece. So I gave myself an extra inch on both sides, put it back in, traced the hole where the center would be, and then we were ready to start stacking them up. To put the pieces of foam together, I grabbed some Gorilla Glue construction adhesive. Eric's Hobby Workshop put me onto this, and it really does work. Gives you a nice, solid bond. One thing to remember, though, when using a caulk gun is to depressurize it. Just click that thing in the back and pull the lever out. That way you don't have it continuing to spill out while you're putting the foam together. Once you're ready, grab the layer of foam you need to put on, press it down, and bada bing, bada boom, you're done. Once you have everything assembled and you're ready to go, it's time to mark out the first cuts. I came in with the Sharpie and marked out the eyes and the interior of the jaw because I knew those were parts I wanted to expose as I cut away the rock face. Now, I popped the skull out. There you go. Come on out. Went in there with the Sharpie and traced these lines fully so that I got a good idea of the angle at which I had to cut. Once everything is marked up, we're going to grab our hot wire tool and get cutting. I started off cutting just making sure that I was getting those spots away where I needed the skull to come out. These are the angles I was really focused on getting, so just straight down cuts, nothing serious. I then grabbed the skull and set it in there trying to figure out, okay, is this where I want it to be? It was, so then I carved in some lines to show me how I wanted to angle this. You see that the jaw is broken there, it was already broken when I got it, probably why it was in the clearance rack. So I'm just going to come in, keep cutting away until I'm happy with it. You can already see that we're starting to get some nice rocky textures as we cut. And this is only going to develop further as we work through the piece. I have the whole skull in there now because I want to get this nice and rounded, make sure that all of the angles conform to what I want it to be. Fast forward, and here we are, the completed piece. You can see that just by working it as I went, a little bit of randomness, letting it slide here and there, we got this really nice rocky texture. However, we've still got some modifications to do, because now it's time to add everyone's favorite crafting component, squirt gun bits. So I wanted to add this piece to be kind of a machine that was helping to operate this smelter. So I looked for my pen, it was in plain sight, and then I came in and I marked where I wanted this to sit. I wanted to embed this back into the foam, so I just drew this line straight down to give me a box, and then I took everything off, grabbed my hot wire cutter, and pressed right in, drew it across, and pulled it right back out. Stuck a little bit on the glue there at the end, but came out nicely. So there we go, squirt gun comes in, perfect fit. Too easy. Turning to the back, I thought it looked a little bit plain, there just wasn't a lot of visual interest, so I decided to add this piece that I'd made out of some chipboard and some cross-stitch meshing. It's a spin on something that Wyloch's Armory does for his Dark Mechanicus terrain. I'll link his video in the description because I use a lot of that in this project. And I just kind of came in, did the same thing, cut back in, top fell off there, and just kept dry fitting it until I was happy with the fit. Once I was done, we'll move on to the next bit. One last thing to talk about is all of those offcuts. Look at them. Some of them are actually pretty big because of some of the ways I cut, so we're going to grab a bin and we're going to save those for future projects. These things can be used for some scatter terrain, or if we need to do any repairs if I screw up later. Spoiler alert, we will need them later. Alright, now let's talk about getting industrial with this aquarium piece. I wanted to add some pipes to it, obviously, and this is what I found. These are some lovely cheap plastic pipes that Eric's Hobby Workshop put me onto. Again, guy's great, check his channel out. But look at this. So simple to assemble them into this great pipe structure that's going to run through the mountain. Now, I'm not going to hot glue anything together at this point because, we're going to have a creative process. Things are going to evolve. I don't know what I want. Maybe this is going to work. I want this pipe sticking out. Or who knows, maybe we're going to change this around. So we're going to keep things loose as we just kind of fiddle around with it, play around, see what kind of lengths work out. But what we do need is somewhere to connect it to. So to find that connector, I went to my bits box. I found this piece, which is the bottom of an Onager Dune crawler from Games Workshop. And as it turns out, we're going to zoom in here so I can show you that this is a great fit. I mean, look at that. These pipe pieces look like they were made to fit into that. So I know this is what I want to use for the wall. Additionally, the texture of the kit is just going to give me a fantastic wall. So, there we go. Let's see it in place. Lovely. However, there's some spaces on the side and at the top there. You can see my finger poking through. So we're going to have to take some chipboard and we're going to fill that in. For those of you who don't know, chipboard is the kind of cardboard that you find at the back of a legal pad. You can just buy it in bulk, and it's really nice for cutting out shapes to back different items on when you need to. Just like this piece here. So once we've got that filed flat, we can slot it in there, just do a little dry fit, because you always want to dry fit these pieces, make sure you've got a good fit, and it looks like we do. So now I'm going to grab my hot glue gun, I'm just going to lay that chipboard piece in there first. Come in here with the hot glue and give it a nice couple of beads along the outside. Really make sure that it's connected to this rock. I don't want it going anywhere. Then just apply a little bit of hot glue to the back, slide it up in there while I've got the working time, make sure it's sitting flat, and there we are. That's good. Look at that. It's going to look very nice on the back of the structure, but we still need to fill in the gaps here. So I grabbed some of the leftover foam offcuts. Yep, they're already back. I just jammed them in there using hot glue and the tip of a file that I had, just to kind of make this piece look like it was embedded to the rock and hide that exposed chipboard. And here it is, finished. Nice rock wall, but now we have to do something on the other side because we can see that chipboard in the back really easily. So I'm going to turn to Games Workshop again. I'm going to use this bit. It's the interior of a rhino that no one has ever seen because rhinos are usually glued shut. So to get it to lay flat in there, because we're going to build over this, I grabbed a file, and we're going to file this all the way down. One very dusty cutting mat later, and here we go. We've got a nice flat surface to attach our chipboard. So I'm going to need to do this in two pieces because I didn't want to really file this thing completely flat because that would have taken ages. And I didn't want to use a power tool because I was afraid this thing would break. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a backing of chipboard for this. I used some offcuts here to make sure we had a nice level base to back it to. Cut out the piece I wanted to back it and glued it down. Next up, I have to figure out how many pieces of chipboard I'm going to need, so again, I just grabbed some offcuts to give myself a good measurement. I then grabbed a ruler and measured out some small pieces of chipboard just to make these support columns. Cut them out with a pair of scissors, chop, chop, chop. And then I just took the hot glue gun and glued them in place. Just dab hot glue, stick it on. Dab hot glue, stick it on. The goal here is to make sure that our chipboard is level with the plastic piece so that when we glue on the faceplate, it looks like this piece is flush with the outer wall. Speaking of the faceplate, here it is. I just traced out the shape of the door and cut it out of another piece of chipboard. Then just take some hot glue, line it in there, and glue the faceplate on. For the top half of this piece, I decided to cut myself out a triangle of chipboard. And then I traced myself a series of lines, each one of them being a little bit over 1/8 of an inch in. This is going to let us add a little bit of visual interest to the piece by giving it a vent. So once we've got the hole cut out completely, we're going to put it against the wall, do a little dry fit, and good. And voila! It seems that the denizens of the warp ate some of my footage and corrupted it. So instead I'm going to have to do a little bit of visual explaining here. So when you see that triangle piece, I created the same backing with chipboard and I added in some cross-stitch mesh. You can find this at most crafting stores. It's often called granny grading by people that I've seen on YouTube, but it creates this really nice vent look. I also went in with a layer of cereal box cardboard to create a nice flat surface for me to work on and to hide some joints, and then I created these beams that were made out of more chipboard. I thought about having one next to the door, but it got a little busy. But for some visual interest, I added these rivets, which were made out of nail beads that I found in the clearance bin at the hobby store. They make a really nice rivet, and they're really simple to use. Alright, let's return to talk about some piping detail. So we had that pipe running around the back, and I had this smokestack. I decided I only wanted it coming out, just the tip. I didn't want it to have that pointed up section. And then, these eyes were big enough, so I decided let's put some in there too. Grabbed a little pipe, dry fit it, see if it works, and it does. So we'll go in with some hot glue and just secure that in, give us some nice eyeballs. Now it's time to unite our aquarium piece with our foam. I knew I wanted these pipes to come down into the back of the squirt gun bit, so that they would stay out of the way of any platforms we decided to add going around the structure. Wanted to dry fit this, and this took a little bit to get right, but once I had a nice fit and I was happy with it, took some hot glue and sealed the whole thing down. Now it's time to start working on the platforms. I decided to go with the chipboard and kind of the Wyloch's Armory fashion of building platforms. Again, can't say enough good things about that channel. He not only inspired me to start building my own terrain, but also to start this channel and share what I was doing with other people. So here we go, the finished product, very nice and easy, chipboard, cross-stitch mesh, and chipboard sandwich. Next up was the command balcony, where the lords of the Dark Mechanicus could oversee their slaves and servitors loading metal into the foundry. So I took a long piece of chipboard and made sure we got it cut at a nice angle so it would sit flush and come off at that angle that I wanted it to. Now that I had the angle, I needed to decide how long I wanted this command balcony to be, and I used the incredibly scientific method of throwing minis on it. I wanted to be able to put 10 models with 32mm bases on there, plus one buffing character. So I took 11 Khorne Berserkers, figured out how they fit onto the platform, and measured it at the end. To support these platforms, I used these 3D printed pieces that my cousin gave me. These prints are from the Warzone Layer 1 set. It was a Kickstarter I backed a long time ago, and I hadn't really used the models for anything yet, but now that I'm doing terrain building, they work great for Mechanicus buildings. So let's flip that over, put it in place, and it's looking good. The next set of platforms I want to add is a walkway that's headed towards the back, and we want to do a little command platform in the back just to place, again, for more models to sit, give you a place to drop in maybe a unit of Terminators or some other kind of big squad. For the edges of these platforms, because it's just a sandwich of, again, chipboard, cross-stitch mesh, and chipboard, we want to make these look a little more presentable. So I'm grabbing some cereal box cardboard. This is actually a Games Workshop box, so we're using some Games Workshop parts here. And we're just going to slice off some thin strips. Here we go. That way we can just line them up on the edges like so. And here we go. Look at that. Is that not much cleaner than the sandwich? I like it. And it gives us just a nice clean finish. Now let's just take a quick look and see how these platforms are laid out. Again, I want to highlight this method is from Wyloch's Armory and his Sector Mechanicus terrain, and it looks great. The chipboard, the granny grading, just gives you a nice industrial texture. But it needs something more. I decided that my walkways needed some fencing to stop people from falling off. There may be no OSHA in the 41st millennium, but we still want to keep some safety. So, took some cross-stitch mesh, and I cut it out at an angle so that it would have this chain link fence texture. Used a model for size to make sure it was the right height for scale, and there we go. Let's get some supports on this. I took some chipboard and sized out the length that I needed to support the entire fence. Cut that out, and then I grabbed my size just to double check it, make sure we're good. Alright, next I cut a bunch of 1/8 inch strips out of that, because these are going to be my fence posts. So I just grabbed my knife real quick because I wanted to test this, and boom. We're going to run this along the length, and there we go. I also decided to add some damage to the fence, just went in there with my knife, kind of cutting at an angle randomly, however I wanted. This could represent rust, battle damage, really anything you want. Once you've done all your damage, it's time to glue on the top piece. Just took a 1/4 inch thick piece to give it a little bit more body, and I glued that down with some tacky glue. And here's the final product. Nice industrial fencing with a model for scale. The last thing we have to make out of cardboard is these stairs. So I drew a grid with the number of risers I need, in this case it was 4, and cut that out. You want to make sure that you trace one line through the center and one line on the vertex next to it so you get this nice solid stringer for your stairs. Size it to fit, trace it down on another sheet, cut it out, and you're good to go make some stairs. I also cut out the actual stairs themselves, and to make sure that they went on where I wanted them to, I grabbed my ruler and measured in. I wanted them to be 3 inches for the stringers, so that would meet up with the platform I had. So I measured in 1/2 inch on each side, drew a line, and those were going to be my guideposts for when I glued it together. And here it is, all assembled. As you can see, we got a nice clean fit with all the risers, Turns out I ended up adding another stringer at the top to make it 5, but we got a good set of stairs. Now, to decorate a little bit, I went and grabbed these nail beads again. This is how I applied them. You heard me mention them earlier back when we were doing the Skull Mountain bit, but I just dip them in a little super glue, and then push them into the model wherever I find them. You can pick them up with tweezers or really anything you want, but I found the tip of the knife works best. I also decided to add some detail to this command platform. I glued together these 2 pieces of discount Lego, because, this is a nice little command console, some way to operate the Forge machinery. I also found this hatch from an Adeptus Mechanicus vehicle that I'm going to put on there, some kind of manhole to get into the squirt gun bit. I also took some of the cereal box cardboard that was left over, and I decided to add some detail, just a few bits. You can see it in the background, and I also added to the stairs. Place for me to put some rivets so that everything looks like it's bolted together. The last thing we need to do with all of the cardboard components is to add a layer of Mod Podge. This is going to act as a sealant against any chemicals that might be in the spray paint, or any liquids such as washes that we'll add later that could cause the cardboard to warp. We want this whole thing to stay nice and flat, so make sure you get the bottoms as well. This will help extend the lifetime of your terrain. The last thing we need to do is do something about that crane so we can operate the bellows. I made it this long piece of pipe just to feel like it was connected to something. Then I hot glued that in place, used 3 points contact for a nice stable bond. I then started to make sure that my crane was in the right spot and decided to add this piece. Originally it worked to control a bucket that was on this crane, but I'm going to use it so that it pushes down the bellows. Once I have that sized up, I glue it all together, one last dry fit check, grab that hot glue, and press it down. With everything completed, it's time to make a base. I traced this out on a piece of 1/4 inch thick MDF board because this will give it a nice solid foundation, especially because we have a lot of different bits that aren't connected to the foam. Remember to always wear protective equipment when you're working with power tools. I cut this out with a jigsaw and then came in with an orbital sander to give the edges a nice bevel. That way it'll blend in nicely with the tabletop. I just kept working it around, going in nice circular motions up and down the base until I had a very nice clean bevel. Once everything's cut and beveled, it's time to glue this thing down to the base. So I grabbed my Gorilla Glue construction adhesive, spread that out all around, pressed it down, and let it dry. I needed to fill in some gaps between both the skull mountain and the foam in the base in a couple of places. So I grabbed some spackle and spread that around the edges. I used this tool that my dad had, it's kind of like a key, to force some of the spackle back in there, and in other places I just used my fingers to get it applied there. Another area I really focused on was this door. Because we'd sanded down the edges, it kind of stood out, so I used the spackle to really blend it in. I came in back here and did the same thing to blend in the crane and these pipes. Once the spackle had set, I came in with some Mod Podge and coated the cardboard that was on the aquarium piece, as well as all the foam. This pink insulation foam does not react well to the accelerant that's in spray paint, so you want to get a good coating. I actually did 2 or 3, letting it dry for about an hour and a half between coats. As I was working, this particular screw was bothering me. The rest of them made sense, but this one didn't, so I grabbed a piece from my bits box and just covered it up. Little power pack of some kind. After some debate, I decided to actually spackle the whole base. The spackle gives a nice texture to it, and it's really cheap and easy to put on. So I mixed up a whole bunch and just slathered it on the base everywhere. You can see there are some natural ridges that'll form as you're pushing it around with the putty knife. Preserve these. They're going to make some nice texture, especially if you're doing kind of a more volcanic terrain where there were lava flows, and now it's spread out and cooled. While this was still wet, I decided it needed a little something else, so I grabbed some chunks of obsidian and just started to sprinkle them in. Once I saw how they were falling, I thought, let's make these into like some rock outcroppings, some formations of obsidian that had formed naturally. I think they look pretty cool, and the nice thing is they'll stick into the wet spackle. I also decided that I wanted to add some of these aquarium pebbles, again, just to give a little variety to the texture, some just volcanic rock that had formed that wasn't solidified into obsidian. So I just took a cup and sprinkled it around. The last thing to do here is to take the putty knife and mix everything together. This will help blend the things we've added into the spackle that we already have so that it sticks a little better and looks, again, more natural. Once we let everything dry, we're ready to prime this. I gave the whole thing a coat of black spray paint, but the foam just refused to go completely black, and I had these few little chips around the edges. A way to fix this with the spackle is to mix paint into the spackle, but I didn't learn this trick until later, so we'll just use a cheap acrylic craft paint to bring it all together. Next, we did an overbrush of a dark gray. Overbrushing is like dry brushing, but you have a little bit more paint on the brush. This is going to give it a more natural color similar to what volcanic rock actually looks like rather than pitch black. Next I came in with a mix of blue and that dark gray from before. This gives it a nice shadowing effect, and I really like how this looks specifically for volcanic rock. It gives it a little bit of sheen, a little color differentiation that you don't see elsewhere. Next we do a dry brush of a standard gray. We're starting to go less and less paint on the brush, just trying to pick out those raised areas and start to highlight the textures here. To add one last pop, we go in with a mix of an off-white and that middle gray. We're only picking out the highest points in the model, really trying to give it these details without compromising the colors we've already built up. I then took that off-white and just decided to really highlight these skulls. I liked how they stood out in the aquarium piece, and I wanted to bring that back into the piece now that it was painted. For any of the parts that were metal, I gave them a base coat of burnt umber and then came in with an overbrush of this gunmetal. This is going to help give it a nice rusted metal appearance because that brown is going to show through where there are gaps in the gunmetal. If you want your metal to be a little bit brighter, you can also use a silver. For example, I went in and picked out the screen and console for this computer bit next to my door, as well as the rivets. Anywhere that I thought rust wasn't likely to build up quite as heavily, I came in and touched that up with the silver. Now it's time to assemble my sub-assembly. I liked the way the skull was painted, so I didn't put it in there initially, and I didn't attach the platforms at the beginning because I thought it would be easier to paint them separately. I will pay for this in time, but it looked like a good idea to start. Anywhere that had the stone colors, I came in with a black wash. This is a recipe I got from Black Magic Crafts, and it did a phenomenal job bringing all my colors together. Make sure that wash gets spread out over everything, and especially in the recesses so you get some nice shadows built in. Over the metal bits, I came in with a brown wash, also from Black Magic Crafts. This is going to give us a nice rusty feel, but not new rust. This is old rust, a Dark Mechanicus foundry that's existed for millennia. So those brighter colors have been dulled down by other spills, volcanic ash, and anything else you can think of that might have weathered this structure. I detailed this panel using some Games Workshop contrast paints, and then I decided to do a little object source lighting with this light fixture I had above the door. I dry brushed down some yellow, and I honestly went a little heavy, but you can correct this by coming back in with some gunmetal, and then applying your washes and other techniques that we've already talked about until you get the right balance of color. When it came time to glue on the bellows, I suddenly realized why my sub-assembly was going to get me in trouble. This didn't actually have a level base to sit on because I had already created the spackle terrain. But I went ahead and hot glued this down, let it set for a second to get that stronger bond, and then came in and hot glued the arm on. I was going to have to come in and gap fill this, but that's life. Now it was time to attach the platforms. I came in, applied some hot glue where I knew the contact points were going to be, and started settling these bits in. I started from the front and figured I'd work my way around. Used the hot glue to create kind of a weld between them, as well as gluing this down to the platform. Push that down there, try and make sure that the pieces are level and lined up. Then, swing this around, and we're going to try and work the other two back pieces on. And again, sub-assembly proved not my friend, as these rocks were in the way of me getting them into the positions that I had them originally. So I had to go get a screwdriver and pry out some of the rocks that I had, creating this big white holes in the spackle. And obviously you can see I'm having a little issue getting everything level. In fact, it was so bad that I had to use some of my offcuts to prop up the platforms to make sure they were actually level on top. But, sometimes you live, you learn. I shouldn't have done this in sub-assembly. So now I'm going to pay for it. Take some hot glue, and I glue in parts of these offcuts just to form the base of the support, and then I'm going to come in and spackle over that and then repaint it. It's going to be time consuming, it's going to be annoying, because I have to do the whole thing. But, what are you going to do? Gotta make it look pretty in the end, right? While the spackle dried, I realized that the models didn't really have a way to get up this side of the rock face. So I grabbed some ladders that came out of some Lego kits I had lying around. They were the right height for what I wanted, and I just painted them up using the same technique we used for the metal. Once I settled them in the right spot, I grabbed my hot glue and glued them into place. My idea for the mouth had been to have this pit that led down into a pool of molten metal, but I'm not a great two-dimensional painter, especially with perspective, so instead I just printed out this image of a hole. I searched D&D lava pit, and surprisingly, once you cut it out and get it in there, it looks really believable. Just make sure you put in a layer of Mod Podge on both sides of the piece of paper so that it doesn't curl up on you at any point. The last detail I wanted to add was some smoke coming out of these pipes. These are smokestacks, so I really thought they needed some smoke. So I grabbed some wire. This is just regular wire. I found it in a clearance bin at a hardware store, so it's been serving me nicely. So we cut off a length of that, and then we grabbed some of this Christmas snow. People use this to make like Christmas villages or other holiday decorations, but for our purposes, this is going to be our smoke. We're going to take some hot glue, and we're going to wrap this snow around it. I used a mixture of artist charcoal and black spray paint to get the right color, and then I came in and hit it with a layer of spray sealant. This matte varnish is just going to help it keep its shape and lock in that dust of charcoal that we use to color it. To attach our smoke, we're first going to apply a layer of hot glue inside the pipe. Then we're going to grab our piece and take the end that's going into the pipe and twist it up. It's going to expand once it's inside the pipe, and this will create a good contact point with the hot glue. And there we have it, a nice piece of acrid smoke pouring out of our Demonic Smelter. The last thing to do is take it outside and give it a few layers of matte varnish. This will just protect all the painted components and help it stick together a little more. I hope you all enjoyed this build. Now let's put some models on it and see how it'll look when we're playing. Here we see the Space Marines of the Scarab Guardians chapter facing off against the Dark Mechanicus. I'm going to be making more videos, both doing some terrain building and some kit bashes. So if you want to learn how to create legendary heroes and epic terrain for them to battle on, subscribe to this channel and share it with your friends. I hope to see you all again the next time we ignite the Forge of Sagas.